So, would you like to introduce who and where you are, please?
Right, well, who I am is fairly easy. I'm Pete Jarrett, and I do lots of things. It's quite hard to narrow down, but principally I'm the Director of Research and Development for a company called NATTC. The vision of NATTC is to provide a start-to-finish service for reasonable adjustments in the workplace. From well, not necessarily diagnostic, but from assessment, workplace needs assessment, through to provision of support, and more particularly a long-term sort of tracking of how people do in the workplace.
And is this in person? Is it digital? How does that work?
So, I mean, it's a combination of both. I mean, we use digital tools because that makes... I never said where I was. I'll do that in a minute. People will wonder why I'm swiping. So it's a combination of both, because digital tools enable us to be more efficient, and give us more nuance with data. But the digital tool augments a personal experience. It's not intended to replace it.
That's it. So the digital tool can capture and process data better than people can, but at the same time, people can interpret people better than digital tools can. Or is that not true these days? I mean,
I think it is, and I would put caution on the digital tool can do it better. The digital tool can do it more efficiently.
Which is the thing you talk about when you talk about neurodiversity.
And so it can capture nuance in data in a way that it's very hard for us to do intuitively from observation. But essentially what we're trying to do is bottle what an expert teacher does, or an expert occupational therapist does, in terms of capturing that and allowing it then to be sort of used in a different way.
And can this digital tool capture, and I suppose this is a link I'm trying to make, can this digital tool capture data in a culturally sensitive context? Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you very much indeed. I really appreciate that.
Cheers.
Now for a commercial break.
Yes. So at this point we should probably say that we are in India. We're not in Heligan Gardens in one of the biomes. We are actually in India. And we're not necessarily sponsored by Indian breweries.
Although if you would like to buy an Indian beer, this is a very good one.
But we'll talk about what we're doing in a minute. Where were we?
I was asking about the collection of data and cultural context. So,
wow. Collection of data and cultural context. So, I mean, I think it's fairly open in terms of the press about the risks of bias in big data sets. And we know that there are systemic inequities that happen in the way that we ask questions. I think it's one of those things that if you're aware of it and your design is good, you can try and mitigate. But without big data sets, continual testing, and validity testing from outside, it's difficult. But
is there a danger? I mean, this is a genuine worry, I suppose. Maybe a lot of people have. Is there a danger that in doing the testing, you have to collect people's data, and this is something that people maybe don't consent to, or don't understand what they're consenting to?
I think understanding what you're consenting to is a large part of the ethical process of setting up data collection, and I think it has to be really clear the purpose of data collection, and you have to be really clear about how you're conforming to legislative requirements. But there is absolutely a moral requirement beyond that to make sure, again, that your design, your infrastructure design is robust, reliable. And I feel very strongly that we need to use tools that allow the data to be fully in the ownership of the individual. But the elements of the data very clearly are then contributing to the wider good. And I think the majority of people consent to depersonalized data or anonymized data, and there's a difference between the two, but we won't get into that.
Maybe, just to put in on that, maybe we consent to it. Maybe we're just desensitized to it.
Well, I think that's the other thing. I mean, I'm fully aware, because I do it myself, how rarely people actually read terms and conditions.
I never do, you know.
Yeah. And so I think the first thing is that somebody entering into a system that is looking for reasonable adjustments is looking for a return on their investment, so that they are, to some extent, morally consenting.
Yeah.
To help themselves.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right, and I like it when occasionally, and it is occasional, and some of the organisations we work with are more security conscious than others, because they need to be. When people do push back and say, we want to see all the documentation you have, all your risk assessments, and proof that your data is stored in, you know, where it's stored, how it's stored, whatever.
So if I can move on into, so we're in India at the moment. Is there a different context working in India? And do people want to know different things? Does it matter in a different way?
I think, yes. I mean, absolutely. Culturally, it's very different. I think, but it's one of those things. It's a bit like neurodiversity, actually, when we say that everybody is different.
Yeah.
But equally, there are huge similarities. Between people. And I think,
and it's not that there is one Indian context,
and there is not. And I mean, it's diverse. You know, we are currently, Mumbai is, I don't know whether we're talking kilometres or miles. I'm going to go for kilometres. Mumbai is 25 kilometres across a harbour estuary. And so we're in, although it's close to big container ports and fairly big cities, it is essentially a rural setting. And this is a world apart from Mumbai. But there again, northwest London is a world apart from northwest Devon.
And young people in northwest London are a world apart from old people in northwest London.
And young people in northwest Devon are definitely a world apart from everybody. I lived in Somerset and Cornwall, so I might have some sort of Devonian bias, but you can edit that out, can't you, Martin?
Definitely.
Yeah. So I mean, I think philosophically, the culture, schema that people create is complex. I think it's fairly well known that South Asia has, and West Africa, you know, it's not exclusive, have very different views to where we are in Europe with disability now, we are now, and that's the important thing. And I think
it's taken us a journey, hasn't it?
And these are emerging economies, and you know, so rural here is still informal subsistence to some extent, not for everybody, but you know, there's still a population. And so access to education, many of the young people in the school that is just up the road are first time learners, they're first generation learners. You know, their parents have not been to school.
And we were in a school looking at some of the teachers who
and the teachers are the first people in their family who've gone to school. And then of course there is access to education, and I think in Britain and Europe we have a very privileged attitude about access to education because we go back generations and generations, and to think that we have children whose parents are in their 30s or late 20s who didn't go to school. You know, that's how recent it is. And I mean, that's not everybody, but there's a significant population. So it presents different challenges. There are different ways of approaching the school's responsibility. They're not fundamentally different, and the things you hear on a parents' evening here are the same that you might hear in a parents' evening in
Yeah.
the UK, but
Yeah, yeah.
phrased slightly different, and
Yeah.
the language is Indian English is different to English. But one of the other things I think is really interesting in our areas in neurodiversity and dyscalculia. I'm a specialist assessor of dyslexia and dyscalculia, because when I did my specialist teacher assessor training, there was no course for dyscalculia. Thank you, Margaret Crombie, for setting out the framework for that. That here we have regional languages and then a language of instruction, and children can go to school in a school that is so here we are in Maharashtra, it'd be Marathi is the state language or the regional language. They can go to a Marathi medium school, they can go to a Hindi medium school, and they can go to an English medium school. And what's really interesting, therefore, is they are. So what I often talk about is they're taught to count in one language. Or they learn to count. They learn to count at home with their parents, engaged in play like all toddlers do. At which point they're starting to build that relationship between the non-symbolic numerical condition and the symbolic language-bound numerical conditions. They will learn to count in one language, and then age 4, when they might not have been exposed to English, and this is an English medium school that we've been looking at today, they suddenly have to shift to communicating in the language of instruction, which is English. And what's really interesting, and I think it's not as fully explored as I would like it to be, is the cognitive load of learning to count. So your number sense is essentially in one language. And the language in which you communicate it is in a different language.
And just to interject, I didn't realise until a couple of days ago, maybe last night even, that there's a different grammar of numbers, because you've got different number magnitudes in India.
Yes, so there's a different place value system for utilising lakh and crore. And
would you like to just explain very quickly what lakh and crore mean?
Okay, so basically, when we get to the thousands, in rather than thousands of so when we get to the thousands, in the international place value system, we work in groups of 100 tens units, 100 tens units, 100 tens units. When we get to the thousands, up to 10,000, all of a sudden there is a new comma, and we are then dealing with lakh. Okay, and then 2 more, and we're then dealing with crore. So it gets up to a point in the thousands where we start going up in tens instead of hundreds. And if you put the place value columns one above the other, the magnitude stays the same. The punctuation is what changes, the grammar. But of course, in a sentential context, if this was like a language sentence and the punctuation changed, the meaning would change. Well, absolutely. And again, one of the other issues we have with that is that the grammar of Hindi and Marathi is fairly similar to Hindi. In fact,
we had a look at the language.
We were looking at the written language earlier on, and I was doing a really bad job of trying to spot what was Marathi and what was Hindi. And I think they said it was in Marathi and Hindi, and it turned out it was all in Hindi. But the grammar of that. So again, we have that people having to shift, employ cognitive load. What interests me is that, when you talk to well-educated professionals who speak English very well, they will say that they still do their mental arithmetic in their regional language, the language they learn to count it. But they communicate it very efficiently in English. What really fascinates me, because the language you learn to count, as I say, is that's your number sense in a way. Your way of communicating your sense of number is bound in your regional language. What I don't know has been explored is that combination of dyslexia, dyscalculia, what is working on which, and the cognitive load, and how much that impacts a learner learning. And this is right at the root of I think some of the things that we don't know but need to know, because we do have a tendency to work in Europe and North America, particularly where there is one primary language at home.
Yeah.
We learn to count in English
Yeah.
in the UK, or Welsh.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I've got Wales in the back of my head for a bit of a.
I mean, I lived in Wales, and you're moving to Wales.
Yeah,
so,
yeah, and I you know, and they've, you know, there's some very good research happening about the relationship between learning Welsh and learning English and that kind of thing. But actually learning, if you learn to count in Welsh, and then you go to an English medium school, or you're expected to communicate in English, or you're watching television, or your bank account, your text-to-speech software doesn't work in right particularly well. You know, so it is fascinating, and so but it gets right to the heart of, you know, all of these things that I think, again, the privilege that we have of living in a primary language learning instruction sort of framework is interesting, and it really makes me wonder whether there are, and what the implications are for people that struggle in the learning environment.